Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Toy, and I am an MBA student at MIT Sloan. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel, Chasing Greatness, a conversation with GMs across sports. Our panelists today are Daryl Morey, President of Basketball Operations for the Philadelphia 76ers, Nick Caserio, Executive Vice President and General Manager of the Houston Texans, and David Stearns, President of Baseball Operations for the New York Mets. Our panel will be moderated by Michelle Steele from ESPN. The panel will run for 40 minutes, and 5 minutes at the end will be saved for questions. Please submit questions via our Cadence app, and with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here on this panel with some of the smartest minds in sports and Daryl. That was nice. I focus grouped that at the speakers event last night, and wasn't sure. It was Nick. It was almost going to be you.
Sure, Kill. It's definitely,
Dodged it this time.
But
it's definitely what Philadelphia fans feel right now.
Oh well, we'll get into that. But what's interesting about this panel, of course, is that you're coming at it from 3 different points of view, but 3 very different leagues. There's a lot of commonalities, though, I would imagine, in the experience that you guys have that very few people in this country have, and that is being under the microscope of thousands, if not millions, of fans every day, and what that's like to live that life. I'm not going to get into your muted words on Twitter yet, Daryl. We'll get to that a little bit later on this panel.
They're smart enough not to be on Twitter. So
Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly right. We learned from Daryl.
Yes. But yeah, there's commonalities, whether it's roster development, building your team, draft strategies, and obviously how you guys view analytics as well. But I want to know a little bit about how you got here. So Daryl, let's start with you first. Why are you here? How did you get to that seat you are sitting in today?
I mean, a big reason I'm here is in the front row. Michael Lewis is here in the front row, and I don't think I get a chance to be a general manager in basketball without Moneyball, the book, really, because owners hire our positions, and it's really not a position that you can put in your time or your dues or things like that. It obviously helps put in the hard work, but that's not what often gets you the jobs. You have to convince an owner. And until owners read Moneyball and saw that there might be a different way to think about running their franchises, these other sports like basketball and hockey and football, they were not really going to think outside of that box, I don't think. And so that was a big factor. The very short, least boring version, I was actually into baseball because if you wanted to use data and I wanted to beat my friends in Stratomatic and Tabletop and Earl Weaver Baseball, one of the early computer games. That was how I got into baseball data. And there wasn't data for basketball. There was like points and rebounds, but nothing good. So that's how I got into it. I read Bill James, I think he's here as well, abstracts. And I ended up being lucky enough to get hired as a baseball analyst at Stats Inc. And while I played basketball, I loved basketball, but baseball was all I could do data-wise. At the firm, Stats Inc., they started a basketball piece of it.
Yeah.
And I was in their first book and first analysis in the early 90s. And, then many, many years later, through the Celtics, I got a chance to apply data to basketball. And, baseball was too far ahead even by then. So, that's sort of how I got to this spot.
Have you fantasized yet when they do the movie version of Moneyball for basketball, the Morey Ball version, who will play you in that movie?
I think my wife wants Josh Duhamel. I think that's her. She would prefer that.
We'll put a good word in. Jumping off from baseball, baseball is a statistical sport, obviously. You became the youngest GM of a baseball team when you were 30 years old with the Brewers. How did you get to that position a lot of people in this audience would like to know, from that vantage point?
Yeah, I think my path is frankly fairly conventional. That I grew up loving baseball. I grew up playing baseball. At some point in high school and early in college, I realized that was going to be the end of my playing days, and I wanted to find ways to stay attached to the game. Similar to Daryl, I was impacted by Moneyball. I was impacted by a lot of the younger executives who seemed to be making their way through baseball, some of whom had backgrounds that seemed to be somewhat similar to mine. And so I applied for every internship I could possibly think of applying for when I was in college. I got a few, was able to eventually get a full-time job. I worked at the commissioner's office for Major League Baseball, and then was fortunate to work for some really good people at a couple different organizations. I worked at the Mets for a little while. I worked at the then Cleveland Indians for a little while for Mark Shapiro, Chris Antonetti, Mike Chernoff. Went to work for the Astros, and then ultimately got a chance to be general manager with the Brewers. I think baseball is at such an interesting point here, where the analysis within baseball is at such a high level that a generalist like me isn't really doing the analysis anymore. I mean, we have people with exceptionally fancy degrees who are working on really complex problems. Some problems take years to solve at this point in baseball. And so I think the role of the general manager, the baseball operations leader, has transformed a little bit from someone who's actually involved in the analysis, someone who can come up with the competitive advantages, to a person who is managing the analysis and hopefully putting really smart people in place to come up with the competitive advantages that we can then execute on.
Yeah, there's so much information, but how do you distill to like the
Sure.
stats that actually matter, the analytics that actually matter? I imagine a lot of people in this New England crowd know who Nick Caserio is. 20 years with the Patriots, 18 of those seasons in player personnel. I mean, when you talk about traditional background, you're like the proverbial football guy on this panel. What were some of the intangibles, Nick, that you took from New England? So no, we're not necessarily talking about stats here, that you apply now to your position as the GM of the Texans?
Yeah, I think if you had a yearbook of least likely people to be sitting in this chair, I would probably be that person. Obviously my background is a little bit different, how I got started. I mean, just kind of hitting that real quick. I mean, I was actually going to get into finance. I mean, I was a finance major. I thought I was going to work on Wall Street. Obviously, I wasn't smart enough to do that, but I wanted to pursue football and be involved in sport in some capacity. I actually started coaching. So my background was really, I thought I was going to coach. And then when I had an opportunity to interview in New England.
Scott Pioli told me that he hired you from
He did. I interviewed with Scott. I saw Scott a little bit earlier, but I interviewed with Scott. It was June of 2001. I'll never forget it. So I flew up. First of all, I didn't know what a front office was. I had no idea. Like scouting assistant, player personnel, what is that? I had no idea. I was more on I played. I wanted to coach. I thought I wanted to coach. So I went up, interviewed with Scott. I had the good fortune of being hired by Scott as a personnel assistant, and honestly, I was able to work in a multitude of areas: coaching, scouting, pro scouting, college scouting. I went back on the field and coached. But I think relative to what are some of the things that you can take with you, there's not a one-size-fits-all, like when you leave a program, you leave a system, you're going to apply those things. I think, honestly, it goes back to basic principles, and first principles, blocking and tackling. It's about work ethic, it's about drive, it's about mindset, it's about consistency, it's about showing up every day and producing a good product. And if you do good work, you'll get more work and you get more opportunities. So if you show that you're capable of handling large amounts of work in different areas, then you'll be more inclined. Actually, as it pertains to statistical analysis, my second season, I was a quality control coach. So you break down all the film. We literally had to write down every play. You had to pad it for Coach Belichick. A game took 8 to 10 hours, like no joke. Like you had to have all 22, and if a circle was wrong, Bill would say, hey, you got to erase that and move it over. No problem. But following the 2002 season, it was essentially, hey, why don't you, if Josh McDaniels and I work together, you guys go study the league, look at every defensive back, look at every receiver, and see if you find any trends or find anything that stands out relative to strengths, weaknesses, who's a good player, why is he good, what are some of the things that are important. And then we took that work from February, and he said, you guys are going to go out in March, you're going to do the pro day circuit, you're going to watch workouts, you're going to time players, you're going to watch them move, and then we're going to put all this information together into a profile of a player and say, all right, what do we think we have? And it was no playbook or template, here's how you're going to do it. You kind of figure stuff out. So I think if you have that mindset and you adopt that mindset, you can figure anything out with the right intentions and maintaining curiosity and just a sound work ethic.
You know, I mentioned this at the top of the panel. You guys are all under a microscope. Some of the spotlights might be a little harsher than others. You're sometimes going to have to make very unpopular decisions, right, with fans. And you need to have conviction about those decisions. You know, there is a famous story about Ted Thompson, the Packers GM, who was sent as a scout, this was a tryout now, by Ron Wolf, to evaluate a third-string quarterback for the Falcons. That ended up being Brett Favre. He told Ron Wolf, even if you need to trade a first-rounder for this guy, you need to get him. And that's what they did, and they got him, and it worked out. Have there been decisions that you've had to make that have been unpopular with your own front office, right? Or something where you had to put your own neck out there a little bit and have conviction? You know, we all love collaboration, we love consensus, but have there been times where you've had to like go out there and say, I feel strongly about this and we're doing it?
I remember one in particular earlier in my career. I was about in year 3 or 4, like I think you were, David, in year 2, I guess, David, right? Yeah. Where we were on path to be, I think, the 4 seed in the playoffs that year. And our starting point guard was Rafer Alston. And we really liked, it was similar to this, Kyle Lowry, who was like the 3rd string point guard in Memphis at the time. And yeah, like I actually distinctly remember Leslie Alexander, who was a great owner. I was with him for many years. He and the head coach were worried that this was the right move because you're making a change in the middle of the season, actually 3/5 of the way into the season at the trade deadline, trading your starting point guard. And I remember distinctly the owner reading the newspapers who were very against the trade at the time, and he said, well, this one better work out.
No pressure.
Yeah, so, and
Right.
that one did, and I have many that didn't work out as well, so we're just everyone should know that we'll selectively probably pick good stories, and it's absolutely the case that you need to make sure you know that there's that bias as well, so.
Yeah.
But that was probably the biggest one I remember, because early in your career, everything's magnified because you don't have a track record to lean on to say, yeah, I've done this before and I can do it. You have so many people second guessing everything. And, you know, I feel for Nick and David, they're both in extremely harsh markets early in their career. And I think that's a really, really tough position to be in. And both of you guys are excelling so far. It's great. Sorry, no pressure, Nick or David.
Well, all of us have to make a multitude of decisions over the course of a season. And every decision you make, it's not going to be popular. And you just have to have conviction and belief in what you're doing. I would say my first year, I'm not going to rehash the situation that we inherited when I
Your
arrived.
first year in Houston.
But
Yeah.
it wasn't ideal. We had obviously a quarterback situation. We didn't have a first-round pick. We didn't have a second-round pick. So we were void of any draft capital. And the first selection that we made was Davis Mills, which elicited a response from Rich Eisen where he almost fell off his chair. It's like, well, what the hell is Houston doing? We actually were just trying to go through systematically and make good rational decisions that we felt were in the best interest of the team. And I would say in Davis's situation, there was a player that we had identified, we had graded a certain level that we felt he could at least be a competitive backup quarterback in the league for a long period of time. And if he had to play for a short period, just given our situation, that he would at least be able to go out there and be competitive. Now, we could have done more to help the overall team. He put himself in some situations. I think his first start was against Buffalo, which on the road with the Bills Mafia is probably not the best place to be. So, and he struggled. But at the time, there was a lot of discussion, essentially like, why would they do that? What are they doing?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
we're just doing what we feel is in the best interest of the team and the organization. And you have to, I know it sounds simple, but you have to be disciplined and be able to block out the external noise, because in the end, you're the one that has to live with your decision, not the fans on the outside. And we also understand we're in the entertainment business, and there's multiple mediums that are available for people to voice and express their opinions. We're certainly cognizant of that, but we just have to have conviction and belief and trust the people around you that you're just making good, sound decisions over the course of time, because those are the things that hopefully lead to sustainable success.
Well, I mean, I don't know if it was unpopular, but there was some skepticism when you traded up to number 3 overall to take Will Anderson. And
Yeah, no, that was I mean, if you were to,
That worked out, by the way. He's
well, I
Pro
would just
Bowler
say, if you were to plug
Defensive Rookie
that
of the Year.
formula into the trade chart, you know, it was tilted heavily towards Arizona. And our philosophy was, well, who cares? It doesn't matter. Like, he was one of our highest graded players with, and I would say, the type of person that you are. I know sometimes this gets lost, but we're in a people business. And it's about the people and their makeup and their DNA and the way Will was wired and his mindset, the way he practiced, his leadership, his toughness was something that we needed for our team at that time. So D'Amico and I were basically said to ourselves, look, if we have the opportunity to do this, let's go ahead and do it and not look back. Because when you make a decision, you can't worry about being second guessed or what if it doesn't work out. And in the end, it's about the players and how they perform. But I would say that was a pick we had absolutely zero reservation about, despite what
Giving
it
up
may
a
have
first
looked
rounder
like.
for 2024.
Yeah,
to
we
get him.
were, I think we were at 11 or 12. We were at 2-12 that year. So we moved up from 12. We gave up a 1, a 2, and a 3 and flipped something back. And, you know, it was a significant amount. I think we lost out on 1 or 2 players that we'd identified. But in the end, like, Will is one of our best players. He's the captain his second year. So it doesn't mean we were right. It just means that we had a lot of conviction and belief in what we were doing, and you can't be afraid to make decisions.
On a big trade, do you run a downside risk analysis? Like, what if this goes awry, right?
Yes.
What does that look like?
Well, I did want to first back up something Nick said, which is when I first got the job, one of the best pieces of advice, I'm sure you guys hopefully got it too, is that on your conviction point, that, you know, only one team wins at the end of the year. It's almost for sure always going to not work out. So if you're especially first in the job, you better be doing the things you believe in, because it's probably going to fail either way, and you won't forgive yourself for not at least going for what you think is the best thing. In terms of risk analysis, I think it's pretty straightforward. Anyone in finance, whatever, us and baseball have the best tools for this. I think it's harder in NFL based on what I understand. Yeah, you're just looking at a probability distribution of base rates of players of different types, free agents, drafts, whatever, and looking at, what is the risk of it hitting the downside, mid-side, upside, and you expect value it, and you look at the variance and you make a decision based on that.
I mentioned, David, that you started as a GM in Milwaukee. You're in New York now.
Yep.
Full disclosure, I was talking to a Brewers fan recently. They're a fan.
That's
They're a
good.
fan.
That's good.
And she said, what is it like to have a blank check to spend on players?
So, and that
now
is,
that you're in New York. It's a blessing and a curse.
yeah, it's more blessing than curse. You know, I mean, money in our sport is an advantage. It opens up the entirety of the player universe to you, and you can be very creative with how you construct rosters. You can be very creative with how you consider different transaction patterns, something that in a place like Milwaukee is a little bit different. I think in all of these decisions and everything that Nick and Daryl have touched upon, like that, the conviction is important, and the conviction is important regardless of whether the decision turns out to, like, whether it works or not. And I think you have to really believe that in these jobs. If
Right.
you're judging yourself exclusively based on the results of your transactions in a finite period of time, you're going to go crazy. Like, we're all judged over time, right? We all got to win games. That's why we're hired to do these jobs. But if we're judging ourselves, or we're judging our staff, or we're judging our process based on near-term results on any individual transaction or any individual groupings of transaction, we're going to drive ourselves crazy, and we're also probably not going to be very good at our jobs. So it's the conviction in the decision, the conviction that we went through the proper forms of analyses of all sorts, and have the proper process in place to lead to those decisions, regardless of whether it works out or not. I think we've all made unpopular decisions in our careers, and most of them, at least for me, looking back, I'd make those decisions again, even if it didn't have the result I was hoping for at the time.
You've had the benefit of making some very popular signings lately.
Yeah.
Juan Soto in particular, biggest free agent in Major League Baseball. When you're approaching a negotiation on that level, how much of it is sort of analytics based versus like, we're just going to do what it takes to get the biggest star who's available?
So in New York, the valuation methodology changes relative to when you're in a place like Milwaukee. One, our pool is just bigger of dollars we can spend. Expectations of what we're trying to do every single year are a little bit different, both internal and external. Look, it's going to be tough purely on any of the analysis that any club is doing, that any public analyst is doing, to justify a contract like the one that Juan Soto gets. But I think that speaks to the unique situation that he provided for us, the unique situation he entered into a market where he had multiple very aggressive big market suitors. And ultimately we felt, and did all the work behind it to justify it, that when you have one shot to go after a premium player like this, and in baseball it's very, very rare to have a premium player hit free agency at such an early age. We are very fortunate in New York that we have the ownership support to do things like this. Understanding all those various distributions that you talked about, understanding what the 90th percentile outcome of this looks like, also understanding what the 10th percentile outcome of this looks like, and then having confidence to still move forward.
What does that look?
I just want to ask a question on, so in NFL is the hardest cap, we have something getting resembling that. Baseball does not. You have to translate your WAR to dollars so you get a rough guideline of what players are worth. How do you do that in baseball when you don't have something farthest from a hard cap and very skewed teams spending different amounts? How do you handle that?
So clearly we have an understanding of what the market as a whole is paying per win. What the Mets should pay per win versus what the Tampa Bay Rays need to pay per win is very different. And that's going to structure how we compile our rosters, how we can compile our rosters. The Rays, for example, and they do a tremendous job, are forced to compile their rosters mainly with very young players, have tremendous roster flexibility, continually churn through rosters and keep their costs very low. We have the luxury, and it is a luxury if we're doing it judiciously and hopefully intelligently, of spending in free agency and being able to pay a little bit more, or at times a lot more, for that incremental win.
You know, you have an owner who interfaces with fans a lot. He cares a ton about this team. He's hungry, he's ready to go. He wants you to compete for a championship. What is that conversation, or those initial conversations, like when it comes to money behind the scenes? Does he tell you, like, pay whatever you need to pay to get him?
No, I mean that's not how any of these guys make their billions. That's certainly not how Steve Cohen, the owner of the Mets, made his billions. But Steve's directive to us, and he's very transparent about it, is he wants to win, and he's going to provide us the resources to win. But he expects me and our baseball ops group to allocate those resources efficiently, effectively, and not waste it. Certainly that's our intent. And as with any sports franchise, regardless of how deep an owner's pockets may be, there are limits, and you can't just spend in perpetuity and expect future spending to cover up near-term mistakes. That's not generally how it works. So we try to be careful with what we're doing. We try to be strategic about it. I don't think we're going to sign a free agent next offseason to the richest contract in baseball history again.
Breaking news.
So you got to be careful when you choose to do it.
Speaking of breaking news, Nick Caserio, you just pulled off a trade yesterday. Thank you for the content for this panel.
We're here to help. Yes.
Yes. Thank you. Well, Stephen A. will send you a thank you note later, I'm sure. But you added to your wide receivers room. Traded for Christian Kirk. How, again, going behind the scenes, no one in this room other than you three are GMs. They could have cut Christian Kirk, right? And he would have been available to speak to any team. You maintain control there. How did that work with you and the Jaguars GM? Hey, call me, please, before you cut him?
Yeah, sure. I mean, free agency starts Monday. That we have the 2-day negotiating period, so we're just about to hit the market. So you have a certain cohort of players that you know are going to be available.
Okay, so you knew he was going to hit the
Well,
market.
twofold. You have a certain cohort of players whose contracts are expiring Wednesday as of 4 o'clock, right? They're unrestricted free agents. So you've evaluated those players, you understand the market, you understand the supply and demand of each position. Then you have another group of players who, before the league year starts, every team has to be salary cap neutral and be essentially at zero. So a lot of players are getting released for cap purposes. The contract might not be commensurate with their role, or the cap charge is too prohibitive to not allow them to do other things, so they get some cap relief. So in Kirk's situation, Kirk was a player like we actually evaluated in 2022. He was a free agent from Arizona. We tried to sign him, but the market dictated his price was too much for the Houston Texans because we didn't see him at that level. So the Jaguars signed him to a 4-year, $72 million deal. Had a real productive 22 season, 23, decent production, had some injuries last year, was cut short, he had some injuries, but when he's been healthy, he's been a fairly productive player. He's young, he has some traits and attributes, so it was actually reported on Tuesday or Wednesday that the Jaguars were going to release him. So anytime a player gets released, we'll go into our database, what do our scouts have to say about them, what's the grade, what do we think, then we give it to the coaches, how do you see the player fitting into the role? So then D'Amico and I had a conversation. More than likely, we were going to probably add to the receiver room here at some point. So in Kirk's situation, it was announced publicly that he was released. So before he hit the waiver wire, we talked about it internally, reached out to Jacksonville. James Gladstone was just hired a week or two ago. And we're not afraid to do business with anybody. So James, hey, look, you might be interested in trading for Kirk. Would you be open to a draft pick? I know I understand you're going to release him. Let us know. Okay, we'll get back to you, had a conversation. Then we agreed on the compensation. A lot of people might say, well, he was going to be released. Why give up draft compensation? Well, the value of a 7th round player in 2026 relative to what you think you're going to get present value, you have to weigh, to David's point, you have to weigh those decisions. Is that the best thing for our team? Do you want to risk that player going into the open market where you potentially could have to compete for them? So we said, well, you know what, we like the player. Let's try to get him on a roster. I mean, we did the same thing. We did something similar with Joe Mixon last year.
Right.
So he was about to be released by the Bengals. Actually,
Gave up a 7th rounder for him, too.
That one happened a little quicker. It was like a Tuesday.
Yeah.
He got released in the morning. He was going to hit the wire that afternoon. We talked about it as a coaching staff. We had the offensive coaches look at it. What do you think? I was familiar with Joe from our time in New England, having played against him. Joe had been a durable, productive 3-down back, and the contract was fairly reasonable. So same thing, called down to Cincinnati. Hey, I know you're going to release Joe. We'd be interested in Joe. How about a 7th and 25 or whatever it was? No problem. We made the transaction, and we gave Joe a contract extension. Joe ended up being one of our better offensive players this year. But today, look, not every decision we make is going to work. I mean, we could talk about the draft. It's less than a 50-50 proposition, right? So forever how smart people think we are or not, like the draft tells you you're going to miss on a lot of different players.
A lot of propositions are 50-50.
It's case by case. You just have to look at the situation and look at the present time, make that decision independent of anything else. But you have to understand the entirety of the market and what the supply and demand and this goes back to basic economics in the end.
The draft's usually a good reminder. Nobody knows anything.
Exactly.
Actually. If you ever need to be reminded, we're all
Especially in the
terrible
earlier
at
rounds.
this. Yeah.
I just thought of this, just speaking of like players who may or may not be available. Did you know Luka was available?
Say again? I couldn't hear you.
Did you know that Luka was available?
Oh. So
I don't think Mark Cuban knew.
No, I know a little bit here. I would say to my understanding, Nico was here last year. If he was here, you could have asked him directly. My understanding is they called every team that had a player they thought they would consider trading him for, is my understanding. And we weren't in that group this year.
We're going to get to audience questions in a couple of minutes here, if anyone has a follow-up on that. But like, how challenging is that? I mean, when you heard about that trade, did you think?
Well, I actually, most people thought there was like, NBA Centel or Ballsack Sports that was announcing it. They were making sure that Wojnarowski was spelled correctly in the tweets, or Shams in this case, to be.
Right, everybody thought he was.
So yeah, I think again, from what I could tell, only Minnesota, LA, and might have been one other. That's a reasonable thing as a GM if you think there's only 3 teams you think you might trade someone for to keep it narrow. In this case, there could have been some optimization around the edges, it felt like. But again, I respect Nico. You know, I think only he knows every situation. Only he has all the information. And I've been on the other side of lots of people saying, you know, that was a really bad move. But they play out over time. In our jobs, you get a grade before you take the test, which is sort of crazy when you think about it. And then no one actually cares what the actual grade is later. They don't ever go back to check. So fortunately, yeah, people graded that trade before anything is played out. So,
Which, while we're talking about grades, the best thing that I despise this. The concept of draft grades the day after the draft is one of the dumbest things I've ever seen.
well, it is a formula. It's literally mock draft minus slot is exactly your grade. So it's, you know, so there's nothing to it. It's a formula.
Tried in baseball, where we don't really know for like 7 years how our
Yeah.
how our draft is doing.
Nobody knows how many rounds there are. I checked. Nobody knows how many rounds of.
There's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Well, no, it's less now, right?
We're down to 20 now.
Okay.
We're down to, when I first started, it was 50, then down to 40, now down to 20.
Are you still taking Willie Nelson in the 20th round?
No, we're not.
That used to happen.
That did used to happen, which is now we're down.
Yes.
Now why we're down to 20.
How close are we to AI calling plays, Nick?
It's not going to happen. I would say
Ever.
no. Our
Oh.
sport,
Wow.
I think
Bold
maybe,
prediction.
I would say
You know, forever is a long time, Nick. I'm just
Well, I would say
letting you know.
building game plans and some of the inputs that go into that, you could potentially see that. But I'd say the way that our sport works, there's just too many variables. You go from 1st and 10 to 2nd and 1 to 2nd and 6 to 2nd and 7. You have a penalty. It's 3rd and long. The wind. What are the factors? There's so many things that go into what actually goes on the field. So as a play caller, like you try to pre-call the game in your meetings, and if you're in this situation, you have, okay, these 3 or 4 plays you're going to get to, but the game just moves so fast. You go from as a play caller, you go from 2nd and 1, so you're just thinking, all right, it's either going to be worst case 1st down or 3rd and 1, right? So then you can go right to your call sheet, all right? 2nd and 1, false start, then it's 2nd and 6, or 2nd and 1, then you get a tackle for loss in the backfield. It goes from 2nd and 1 to 2nd and 7 to 3rd and 7. You're going, wait a minute, 3rd and 1, now I got to go to 3rd and 7. Things just happen and then you have the
as
play
the
clock.
final decision. Having AI somewhere in the stream has got to happen.
Probably on the front end, like I said, when you're going into some of the game plan elements during the course of the week, there probably could potentially be some level of utilization there.
You know, when he was on the Patriots, Tom Brady said he remembered the Super Bowls he lost better than the Super Bowls that he won.
I agree with him.
GMs, a few rings to show
I was
for it,
there for
though.
all of them, so yeah.
But as GMs, like, do you dwell more on the things that didn't work out than the ones that did? And is it hard to keep yourself from doing that? You know?
have to learn from every situation. You learn from losses, and you can still learn from wins, and you just have to do a analysis. Okay, what happened during the course of the game, good or bad, and then you really have to move on. You have to turn the page. I think that's the one thing you have to be able to do, at least from our chair. Okay, your season's over. You lose in a divisional round or a Super Bowl or Game 7. All right, there's a analysis of what happened, and then you really have to turn the page because you go from, in our situation, we played Kansas City, then a week later we're at the Senior Bowl. So if you dwell too much and spend too much time about what happened, you're going to go through it, and you're going to go through some analysis, but I try not to dwell too much on what happened. You have to take the emotion out, as hard as it may seem, because emotion can drive bad decision-making if you allow it to.
I would say quickly it's important, and we can do it in baseball and basketball better than the NFL, to get to true performance, because there are wins where you should have lost, and we can measure that now. I'm pretty sure you can in baseball as well. So it's important you take lessons from the wins that were actually poorly played. I'm sure, in the NFL there's a lot of that as well. So.
You're going through it a little bit right now. You're going through it a little bit right now, Daryl.
I'd say a lot, but yeah, it's been a rough, yeah.
Are you trying to sort of take the emotion out of it? I mean, how challenging is it to?
I think for decisions, probably all of us are pretty good at taking the emotion out of it, because otherwise you're not going to be in the chair for very long. But it's hard. It's definitely hard. It's the first year I've actually gone through a losing season, so it's. It's interesting, and then our sport has sort of weirder incentives than most industries or whatever, where there is some silver linings to bad seasons, and but they're not really in your control. So it's like our fans and many folks will probably decide the ultimate grade for our season based on balls bouncing and coins flipping and things like that, which is the ultimate. You shouldn't really factor that into how you feel about yourself. So
Yeah, you learn a lot when the blank hits the fan.
yes,
Sometimes.
yes.
I think that the emotion discussion here is pretty interesting, because I think we talk about, and I think most successful executives talk about taking emotion out of decision, and people then assume we're emotionless beings.
Correct.
Very different taking emotion out of decision versus having emotion and the competition. I'm pretty emotional about the competition, right? You devote your lives to this, you want to win. When you lose, it hurts, it's emotional. When you win, it's exciting, it's emotional. I think we all experience that, and probably wouldn't do this for a living if we didn't experience that. I think that's a lot of what drives it, is that emotion. But then when you actually get to the decision-making process, we're all doing everything we can to take emotion out of that.
And can you quantify the human element, right? I mean, players aren't robots at the plate. There's a lot of
Players
stuff.
are not robots.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in their lives that could affect what
It's
they're
hard to
doing on-
quantify, but David does it the best. I know that, because not you personally, but their sport isolates that stuff the best, I think. So.
Some of the questions from the audience. The first one's here is for David. With the injuries to key pitchers this spring,
All right, let's go.
At least nobody's paying attention to spring training.
This is a Mets fan.
Hey, listen, there's a few Mets fans out there. How do you assess the current pitching depth? Are there any adjustments or moves being considered?
I love he's getting a radio
Our
question.
beat writers in the audience right now, did they follow me up here from Port St. Lucie?
Quite
Explain yourself,
possibly.
David.
To bolster the rotation, how are you managing the workload for pitchers, David?
Okay, pitching.
Some,
Haven't
yes.
talked about this at all this spring, so let's go.
yeah. Enough about Juan Soto.
We have, for those who are not following our intricacies of our spring training, we lost 2 of our starting pitchers before we even played a game this spring, frankly, before most of our players even reported. The good news is the injuries are fairly short term. Both of them will be back well within the first half of the season. Their rehabs are progressing, and we do prepare for this. I think, especially in baseball, we are constantly preparing for injuries. We are constantly preparing for pitching injuries. Baseball is in the middle of a really concerning trend of pitchers getting hurt at a higher and higher rate. Something we spend a lot of time talking about, spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure out how we can do better here. But until we figure out how to do better, we do try to build as much depth as possible. That was one of our main off-season strategies. So to answer that for the Met fan out there, we feel pretty good about our pitching. Sean and Frankie Montas are going to be back. And we think we're in a good spot.
Well, that's not the only Mets question there is.
Okay.
We'll go to Nick. With the landscape of college sports changing due to revenue sharing and NIL, many college athletes see the tremendous upside of staying in college as compared to going pro. Not everybody, but some. How do you think this new model in college athletics will impact the NFL? I mean, this is definitely is an issue for the women's basketball. I mean, they're making more money, quite frankly, in college.
For sure, the landscape has changed really over the last 2 to 3 years, and it's twofold. So number one, obviously athletes are being paid a certain level. Some players are being paid more than others. And there's some positives and some negatives associated with that. But I would say from an evaluation of the actual player standpoint, it doesn't necessarily affect the evaluation of their skill and what they do on the field. How they handle some of those things that come along with it, honestly, it's preparing them a little bit to be a pro. And you're not going to penalize a player because he makes a decision, A, to stay in school and accept money, or B, he transfers. The one advantage, actually, is you get better at whatever sport there is by playing that sport more. So if a player goes back to school, he has an opportunity for more snaps. He has an opportunity to play football more, so you have more to evaluate. So they may be more prepared when they actually come into our league versus a player maybe that's played less who has more, call it developmental qualities. So we're certainly aware and cognizant of it. You're starting to see some carryover in actually how college football front offices are structured relative to having personnel departments. So it's an
And we have a
interesting.
panel on that coming up.
Okay, we're jumping ahead
That's a
a little
tease.
bit. But,
Yeah.
but I think for all of us, we're always kind of prepared to pivot and adapt and adjust and be flexible. And if you have to make some modifications and tweaks along the way, then so be it.
It's happening in basketball too. So the Zach Edey, I believe, was the first player I can nearly confirm chose to stay at Purdue because I don't know exactly the money he got, but I was told, through intermediaries that the money was materially more than he would have made where he would have been drafted that year. So he stayed in school for many reasons, maybe, but that was for sure one. Pretty sure he would have come out if that money wasn't that significant.
I think we'll have time for another Mets question, but I'm going to ask this one first. We mentioned it before, players are not lab rats, they're human beings. How do you balance relationships? It's a people business. How do you balance those relationships with your players? It is a business. Is it hard to trade and cut players that you have a relationship with?
Yeah, the answer is yes. And I think, honestly, just treat people the way you want to be treated. Just be respectful, be honest, be forthright. Don't make it argumentative. Sometimes it's just a matter of fact. The player will respect that approach versus you kind of find a way to justify making a decision for the wrong reason. So it's just about how you treat people. And what I found is players are very aware. They're very astute. They are very observant. They understand the dynamics. They understand the situation they're in. So we have a responsibility to make sure we uphold our end of the bargain. And if you have to make a decision to either trade or release the player, you try to give them an explanation as to the rationale why, and you always leave the door open because at some point that player may come back around. So if you leave on good terms, then in their mind, they may be more inclined to say, hey, you know what? I really respect and appreciate how they handled that situation. I have no problem going back there if the opportunity presents itself.
What's more nerve-wracking, making a trade that you don't think the other side will say yes to because it's just that bold of a trade, or, talking to a player with some bad news?
Yeah, I think anytime you release players, that's always a difficult situation because they've invested so much time, so much energy. They're immersed in the program. They've put a lot into it. And you have to have some degree of empathy and understanding of what they're going through.
If you release a player, they also have a question in their mind, will I get the next job? Whereas if it's a trade, they often have more years on their contract or some time. So it's a much more of an emotional situation if it's a waiver versus a trade.
I want to give the Mets fans in the audience what they want, so we're going to close on. The Mets found themselves in an interesting situation at the trade deadline where it was 50-50 if they were going to buy or sell. The Mets were buyers, did not give up many high-level prospects, but still a gamble. What went into the thought process there?
So we had a really interesting season in general last year where we got off to a pretty rough start. We were, 10 or 11 games under 500 at the end of May. And then from some date in late May on, we were the best team in baseball. So by the time we got to late July, when our trade deadline is, we were pretty confident in who we were as a team. And so the sort of that buy, sell, what strategy are we going to follow at the deadline sorted itself out for us. Fortunately, I have been in situations where you actually feel like you're on the edge of the coin in that 50-50, and those are very tricky situations. Last year, we were fortunate by the time we got to late July, I kind of knew what we had. I think we as an organization knew what we had and were willing to go and add to the team. And then it's like, yeah, what future value are you going to invest in today? And we evaluated trades of all sort, where some we would trade some of our more high-profile prospects. Those did not come to fruition last year, and so we made more intermediate types of acquisitions that ended up helping our team down the stretch and into the playoffs.
Very quick, what's more exciting, big signing or big trade? Pulling off a big signing or pulling off a big trade?
I would say big signing because you're not having to sort of take away from your team as well.
Nick?
I like them both, so. Yeah.
Diplomatic.
You're
I actually enjoy trades more. I think there's
A chess game.
a little bit of a chess game. It frankly maybe takes a little bit more time to get to a final spot in trades. So I think in the big trades I've been involved in, I feel there's a little bit more reward at the end of that.
It sounds like Mets fans win as the largest percentage of the audience.
We have no more Mets questions. Well, actually, a few more, but
Probably
you
a
can
lot.
find
David will be here
after
all
this
day
panel.
if you need to.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks to all the panelists here today
Thank you.
for your time.